early years of George Blake, a portrait of the spy. As a young man, the narrow canals of Rotterdam mirrored the gray November sky on the 11th of November, 1922, when George Behar, later Blake, first opened his eyes in a modest apartment above a haberdashery shop. The city, still bearing the scars of the Great War, became the backdrop to a childhood marked by absence and adaptation. His mother, Catharina Besdevan, a Dutch Protestant with a quiet resilience, supported them by taking in sewing work after his father, Albert Bahara, Sephardic Jew with British citizenship and a restless spirit, abruptly left for Egypt when George was just 4 years old. The excuse was financial opportunity. But the truth was simpler. Albert was a man who could not stay. Young George grew up in the shadow of that abandonment. The other children in their working-class neighborhood whispered about the boy without a father, and though he laughed it off, the sting lingered. His closest companion was his older sister, Adriana, though their relationship was more rivalry than kinship. She once locked him in a closet for mimicking the Arabic prayers of a Moroccan fruit vendor. The docks became his refuge, where he'd watch ships vanish into the horizon and imagine his father aboard one, bound for a life too grand to include him. School was both escape and torment. At the St. Ignatius School, run by Catholic friars, he excelled in languages, his mind absorbing Dutch, French, and snippets of German from the merchants at the harbors. His teachers noted his sharp memory. He could recite long passages of poetry after a single reading, but also his detachment. He had friends, but no confidants. Playmates for marbles and football, but no one who knew the weight he carried. Sports did not come naturally to his slender frame, though he swam in the chilly canals in summer, relishing the solitude of the water. When he turned 13, a letter arrived from Cairo. His father, now a struggling businessman, summoned him to Egypt, a country that smelled of cumin and colonialism. The English school in Cairo was a world away from Rotterdam's cobblestones. The British sons of colonial officers mocked his Dutch accent. The Arab students eyed him with suspicion, and his father, disappointed by his bookishness, called him soft. Yet it was here that his gift for languages flourished. He added Arabic to his repertoire, eavesdropping on the market vendors and the political debates in coffeehouses. He devoured books, Kipling, Conrad, and, secretly, Marx hidden beneath his mattress. His only true friend was Mohammed, the Sudanese gardener, who taught him to navigate by the stars and play Mancala, the ancient board game of strategy. The world is a game of moves and counter-moves, Mohammed once told him. And George stored that lesson away. By 1936, Cairo was seething with anti-British sentiment. George, now 14, watched as protests turned violent, as ideologies clashed in the streets. It was the first time he understood that loyalty was not innate, it was chosen. When he returned to Europe in 1940, fleeing the war to England, he carried few possessions: a dog-eared copy of Byron, A Compass, given to him by Mohammed, and the unshakable sense that borders between countries, between people, were illusions. The boy who once played spy in the Rotterdam alleyways had no idea, then, how deeply that game would shape his life. He only knew that he was still searching for a father, for a cause, for a truth he could believe in. The making of a spy, George Blake's formative years. The summer of 1940 found 18-year-old George shivering on a coal-stained deck of a refugee ship, watching Rotterdam's skyline vanish in smoke. The Nazis had bombed his childhood into rubble, and England, that mythical island of his father's passport, was now his only hope. When the customs officer at Tilbury scrutinized his papers, George instinctively straightened his tie, the same nervous gesture he'd used decades later when lying to MI6 colleagues. A refugee with secrets, London, in wartime, was a carnival of shadows. George shared a boarding house near Paddington with 3 Polish pilots who taught him two vital skills: how to drink vodka without wincing, and how to spot a tail. He enrolled at Cambridge to study Russian, a language that fascinated him with its chess-like logic, but spent more time in the pubs than libraries. It was there, over warm beer, that a tweed-clad Don casually remarked, "With your languages, you'd be wasted in academia. A week later, a letter arrived inviting him to discuss translation work for the War Office. The recruitment. The interview room at MI6's makeshift headquarters smelled of disinfectant and desperation. They asked about his father, a patriot, despite his flaws, his views on communism, a theoretical curiosity, and most importantly, whether he could shoot a man at point-blank range. George answered yes to all questions, though the last made his coffee taste of bile. His recruiter, a chain-smoking veteran of Istanbul's station, slid a form across the table. "Sign here if you want to matter." The pen felt heavier than his mother's. Sewing scissors. First mission, a bloody education. His 1944 parachute drop into Nazi-occupied Netherlands went wrong from the start. The wind carried him off course into a field where a farmer's daughter, no older than Adriana, hid him in a root cellar for 3 days, through the cracks in the floorboards. He watched SS boots pace above while memorizing radio codes, the same codes he'd later used to lure German agents to their death.
Thanks to this operation, the British learned the real roots of information transfer through the occupied territories. They managed to identify German agents in other countries. The Germans themselves transmitted false information to their spies, not knowing that they were already in the hands of the Allies. Blake showed himself to be a cold-blooded and brilliant manipulator, capable of playing a multi-move game. These are the skills that later made him a valuable agent, but already on the side of the USSR. Interesting fact: later, when Blake went over to the side of the Soviet Union, he himself used the radio game, techniques that he learned in 1944, already against his former colleagues from MI6.
Back in London, they called his deception brilliant. The Dutch girl sent one letter before disappearing into the camps. He kept it folded inside his copy of Dostoevsky, where the ink slowly bled into the pages about guilt and redemption. The Road to Pyongyang. How George Blake walked into the Cold War's trapsoul. 1950. The humid summer air clung to George Blake's MI6 uniform as he stepped off the military transport, his mission orders burning a hole in his pocket. London had sent him to gather intelligence on North Korean troop movements, a routine assignment for their Rising Star and Far East operations. But this was no ordinary war. This was where the Cold War turned white hot, and Blake was walking straight into the furnace. He'd volunteered for Korea, the way some men volunteer for Russian roulette, with a quiet desperation. The memory of his father's abandonment still festered, and the service offered the closest thing to family he'd ever known. But when North Korean forces overran Seoul that June, Blake found himself barricaded inside the British legation, burning documents as enemy soldiers kicked down the doors. The moment of capture was almost theatrical. A baby-faced North Korean lieutenant, no older than 20, entered with a bayonet fixed to his rifle. Blake raised his hands, offering his gold Rolex, a gift from MI6 for his Dutch operations. The soldiers spat on it. "Capitalist toy," he said in broken English, before marching Blake into a truck full of trembling United Nations officials. For 3 weeks, they marched north through monsoon rains, Blake's Oxford shoes disintegrating in the mud. At the Yalu River, something unexpected happens. Soviet officers in crisp uniforms appeared, separating the prisoners. "You," said a colonel with a Leningrad accent, pointing at Blake, "our special guest." The word guest carried the weight of an executioner's axe. They took him not to a POW camp, but to a dacha outside Pyongyang, where the walls were lined with bookmarks, Lenin, English poetry. His interrogator, a chain-smoking GRU major named Vasilev, never raised his voice. "We know who you are, Georges," he'd say always, using the French pronunciation, pouring tea like a host at Cambridge High Table. "The question is, do you know who you're serving?" The revelation came gradually. Vasilev showed him photos of British tanks firing on Malaysian villages, CIA documents plotting coups in Guatemala. "Your democracy," he'd murmur, "has blood on its cufflinks." When Blake protested, The Russian simply smiled. Then prove me wrong. Read this. He pushed across a Formative 6's own assessments of Korean civilian casualties. The numbers didn't lie. By winter's end, the transformation was complete. The man who entered Korea as MI6's golden boy now recited Soviet radio codes with the fervor of a convert. When they finally drove him to the regular POW camp for show, Blake barely recognized his fellow Brits. They saw a broken man returning from interrogation. In truth, he was leaving his old life behind, one carefully staged confession at a time. What makes Blake's story chilling isn't the betrayals, but the ordinary human needs that drove them: the abandoned boy's hunger for belonging, the scholar's thirst for ideological purity, the prisoner's will to survive. In another life, he might have been a priest or professor, but history offered him a different script, written in invisible ink between the lines of loyalty and treason. The double life of George Blake, a spy who changed sides. London, 1953. The rain tapped against the windows of MI6 headquarters as George Blake, freshly returned from Korean captivity, debriefed his superiors. They welcomed him as a hero, unaware that the real debriefing had already happened in a Pyongyang basement, where Soviet handlers had peeled back his loyalties like layers of an onion. Capitalism rewards betrayal, they'd whispered. Socialism rewards conviction. And Blake, the eternal seeker of belonging, had found his conviction at last. The Berlin Tunnel operation, a masterstroke of deception. The CIA MI6 team began digging their famed Berlin Tunnel in 1954 to tap Soviet communications. Blake was among the first briefed. That same evening, he strolled through Kensington Gardens, feeding ducks while mentally composing the message that would alert Moscow. For the next 11 months, as Western agencies celebrated their intelligence coup, the KGB carefully filtered what went through those wires, thanks to their man in London. The operation became the ultimate metaphor for Blake's life. Everyone saw the tunnel. Nobody noticed the man controlling the flow. The first crack appeared in 1960 when a Polish defector mentioned a British mole, codenamed Diamond. Then came the damning confirmation: a Soviet radio intercept decoded by NSA cartographers. On January 1961, Blake was summoned to a routine meeting at MI6's Broadway buildings. The interrogator's opening gambit, "We know about your meetings with Sergei in Holland Park," made his teacup rattle. For 48 hours, they played psychological chess until Blake, ever the pragmatist, confessed his only request: "Tell my mother I've gone abroad." The Great Escape, from Wormwood Scrubs to Moscow.
The walls of Wormwood Scrubs prison were supposed to be unbreakable. But for George Blake, the infamous British double agent serving a 42-year sentence for spying for the USSR, they were just another obstacle to outsmart. His escape on October 22, 1966, wasn't just a jailbreak, it was a masterpiece of deception. Blake's plan was simple but brilliant. With the help of 3 anti-nuclear activists he had befriended inside, he smuggled in a radio transmitter hidden inside a record player. Using coded messages, he coordinated his escape. Then, on a quiet autumn evening, while guards were distracted, his accomplices threw a rope ladder over the prison wall. Blake climbed to freedom in under a minute, vanishing into the London night. But his journey to the USSR was even more extraordinary. Hunted by MI5 in Scotland Yard, Blake hid in safe houses across Europe. He was driven to East Germany in a secret compartment of a camper van, then flown to Moscow under a false identity. When he finally arrived, the KGB welcomed him as a hero, the man who had outwitted British intelligence.
Soviet Russia gave Blake a KGB colonel's pension, a dacha, and something stranger, normalcy. He remarried a Soviet woman named Ida, wrote memoirs justifying his choices, and became a living legend at Yasinevo's spy school. Yet the contradictions never left. This man, who'd sacrificed everything for communism, sent his son to study in capitalist Britain, When the USSR collapsed in 1991, he merely shrugged. Ideas remain, even when empires fall. In his final years at a Moscow apartment filled with Dutch antiques and British books, Blake gave one revealing interview. "Do I regret?" He sipped tea from a Royal Worcester cup, a relic of his MI6 days. "I regret not seeing Adriana's grave. I regret the Dutch girl from the resistance. But turning my coat, no. That was the first honest decision of my life." He died aged 98 on December 26, 2020. His coffin draped in the Russian flag he'd chosen over the British one 6 decades earlier. The KGB archives still withhold 37 files on Blake, including what really happened during those missing 3 months between his escape and Berlin. Some secrets, it seems, even death won't reveal.